Laura, you have been a researcher for a while, and you've been in that space of thinking about sustainability, thinking about actions associated with research. And is excellence something that fosters when you think about how you're using your work to challenge power? Or is it something that reinforces the whole idea of coloniality, over decoloniality? And Laura is a researcher with different hats, as she always says, but has been working in that space of transformative research, transformative development, and innovation a bit. Laura, to you.
Sure, thanks, Joel. Okay, so I've sort of played around a few times this week about how I was actually going to sort of start this conversation. And I wanted to begin on a very sort of reflexive note, sort of my place as a privileged academic, as a white South African sitting on this panel. And that's sort of especially sort of following from Kennedy's really pointed points and the questions that he raises. But sort of something struck me this week that actually just made me angry. And I sort of wanted to share this experience because I think it's extremely relevant for the discussions that we'll be having and for some of the provocations that I'm going to try and articulate in a way that we can engage with from a discussion perspective. And that's, yeah, and so this week I found myself an angry, privileged white millennial African woman. And this was basically because, to reference Mbembe and Natsel's sort of 2004 paper, there are still continent-sized holes in academic discourse. And I think that this is something that we seriously need to be engaging in when we talk about decoloniality. And so that's kind of my starting point now about who actually needs to decolonize. And I think that quite often we sort of put it on ourselves for the formerly colonized to actually sort of think through these methods, think through these power dynamics. That's quite often where a lot of the burden falls. And so my question is really about, well, actually, where do some of these really rich and important conversations need to be taking? And so this is my question on sort of the powerful dynamics that actually mold how we go about doing research in particular. And I'm coming at this very much from an academic perspective, not from a practitioner perspective. And I constantly find myself as being sort of probably one of the worst, and yet sort of always in this position, sort of representative of the African continent in intergovernmental sort of processes in particular. And as a white South African, that is extremely problematic, and yet it has opened up my eyes to the potential role of infiltration of new ideas into these spaces that actually tend to dominate, and that kind of that cognitive sort of coloniality that Kennedy was referring to, and the need to actually potentially be infiltrators in these spaces to be able to sort of provide alternative perspectives, to open up to the diversity of ways of understanding and knowing and being that we know exist, but that still just hasn't really permeated academic discourse. And this can be an extremely weighty position, especially sort of for those of us who have an extremely tenuous claim for representativity. But I think it's an important role of what I think we've started to call sort of space makers, where you can actually create an environment where diversity is actually appreciated. And so that's actually my starting point for this idea of thinking through methods that can actually address power. So there's one thing sort of very much within that cognitive realm of infiltrating spaces that actually that are currently dominant, based on sort of very Western notions of how science gets done, of what knowledge is, sort of all of those things that you articulated sort of at the beginning, Joel. And so I think that there are two different things that need to happen. So the first is about creating spaces for marginalized, unheard voices to actually have their say without the fear or reprisal from more powerful entities. And that is whether they are academics or researchers, or whether they're actually just communities that we need to engage much more actively in an equal role, sort of as best we can do that. And we need to be very reflective as our role of researchers sort of comes with a powerful background, sort of when we engage in these spaces, but to be able to recognize that one very sort of normative intervention is to just make sure that those voices actually have a platform and to provide that platform for them. So that's one, and there's a lot of work that we were talking about in previous things, and that I'm sure we'll engage with again around sort of transformation labs and other kinds of dialogue spaces that we can use to do that. The second is more of this infiltrator role, sort of making sure that we're actually are also building capacities for emissaries or people who can actually bring these stories into the spaces that they're missing, into these spaces of power, sort of into these agenda setting places, so that they're no longer actually marginal opinions or perspectives, but are granted equal legitimacy. And I think that those are two connected but very different roles that sort of need to be undertaken in sort of this quest for sort of decoloniality. But an important caveat to this proposition is that we also need to be very aware of the burden that's actually placed on these representatives who often bear the historical trauma of navigating spaces that are unsafe due to sort of race, sexual orientation, country of birth, gender, etc. And so we can't expect them to carry all the weight of kind of fighting back on these dominant systems all of the time. And so this is where the role of allies, of people who are actually sort of sitting in those more privileged spaces, and sort of as someone who is affiliated to European universities, I sort of see my role very much there, is to be able to provide a space within which sort of these emissaries are able to actually equally engage with the discussions and the topics, that they're not going to be kind of undermined. And I think that that's really important. So that comes back to my question of the who actually needs to be decolonized. I would argue that there's a lot of work that needs to be done just on decolonizing the colonizer. And so sort of work that we can do specifically on the continent, I think this also talks to what you were presenting, Joel, earlier in the framework, is I think we need to go back to the basics, and we actually need to invest so much more in just qualitative research, social sciences, humanities on the continent, because these stories and narratives and experiences and histories cannot and shouldn't be reducible to numbers or to measurements. And yet we sort of emphasize so much the importance of building STEM capacity, which of course we need, but then still sort of wonder why we're left with an inability to kind of really critically think through the colonial legacies that we've been left with. And so we need to build a generation of critical thinkers who can actually permeate sort of into societal narratives around this. And this is sort of drawing on the likes of Steve Biko, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ben Okri, Wole Soyinka. Francis Nyamjo has been writing some really interesting work at UCT on this. And I think that sort of making them not kind of the marginal, but the dominant way of actually how we're going about doing things. We have a rich history of critical thinkers on the continent that we can draw from, and I think we need to recognize that and build on that. And I think that that's the theoretical foundation from which a lot more of this methodological sort of reasoning can flow. And so, for the risk of just like randomly mumbling on incoherently for a couple of minutes, the main take homes I think that I'd like to emphasize here, and the first one is obviously the question of who actually needs to decolonize. And with that, we need good qualitative research that can actually make power explicit, that we can actually use to really theorize what it means to be decolonial. And so we need to invest in building these capacities locally, but we also need to invest in sort of how we're going to be able to infiltrate much more dominant discourses with these ideas and narratives sort of in backgrounds. We need to acknowledge power when we design our processes. So this idea of creating a safe space for marginalized voices to be heard is critically important, but can also be done really, really badly, and we can actually leave people worse off. And so I think sort of being really, really critical and reflexive about how we go about creating those spaces, acknowledging our own sort of power and privilege within that when we go about doing that is super important. And that comes to my fourth point, which is sort of this need to be reflexive of our own selves and spaces and context, because no matter how much you want to kind of reduce things down to numbers and sort of representative hats, we're never going to fully be able to do that. And so we just need to learn how to actually get beyond some of that sort of reducibility into just understanding whole people with all of their backgrounds and sort of histories, and that requires a lot of important, reflexive, engaged thinking. Yeah, so these are all very probably nebulous kind of ideas, but hopefully they spark some thinking, especially as the subsequent panelists come up. Yes, it's not an overnight endeavor. We need to sort of craft our plans for what I call the revolution through strategic groundwork as well as infiltration. And yeah, just think about how we can use the different privilege that we have to sort of be allies to sort of a decolonial cause. And then to use this anger to actually change what we know isn't right. Sort of, I think that's really fundamentally where we're coming from. Sorry, my cat's sort of doing things in the background there. Sort of, yeah, to be able to use this anger strategically to be able to sort of shift the system that we know isn't actually delivering what it needs to do. Yeah, subvert it to a cause of equity and diversity and sustainability. Yeah, so hopefully that makes some vague sense, and I'm really keen to engage with the rest of the panelists and the participants. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks, Laura. That space for talking about decolonizing issues and focusing on decoloniality is a very interesting bit that brings in conversation. And I like the second bit you're talking about using privilege as a space for infiltrating a whole, set of questions that we want to get towards.